My name is John Harper, and I worked as a night shift ward boy at St. Mary's Medical Hospital in New York City. This event took place in 2015 when I first started working the night shifts in this old hospital. St. Mary's was located in a historic part of the city, and the building was almost 100 years old. The structure was ancient, with peeling paint on the walls and a dim light hanging from the ceiling, creating an atmosphere of silence and fear. The hospital's ambience at night felt eerily different from the daytime. Most patients slept through the night, and the staff changed shifts frequently. But the most important thing for me was that being such an old building, strange events often occurred. I had never believed these stories, but I had heard from others that bizarre things happened here at night. When I started my night shift job at St. Mary's, I quickly realized that the area had once been a vital part of the city. Along with treating patients, there were strange occurrences that people often kept hidden in their stories. These included sounds in the silence of the night, flickering lights, and occasionally unusual things witnessed by staff members. I was new and didn't believe in these tales, but I soon discovered that until you experience something terrifying yourself, you can't truly believe it. That's why I dismissed these stories as mere myths, but one night something happened that changed my perception forever. That night was my first shift at St. Mary's. I was excited about my new job, and everything seemed normal. The hospital was quiet, most of the patients were asleep, and the staff seemed relaxed. I thought this night would pass like any other, but soon something occurred that changed everything. Some parts of the hospital were eerily quiet at night, and one of those was Ward 7. This ward was particularly old, and its door was always locked. People rarely went there because it looked dark and foreboding. I had heard about it but had never had to go there until that night when I was instructed to fetch some supplies from the ward. My eyes lingered on the closed door for a moment before I decided to open it. As soon as I opened the door, I felt a strange silence, as if the air itself was devoid of sound. The atmosphere inside was different, as though something was missing. It was an unnatural stillness that made me feel uneasy. I stepped forward, and as soon as I entered, I heard a faint rustling sound. It was as if someone was walking slowly or whispering from afar. I immediately scanned the room but saw nothing. The interior of the hospital was old, with layers of dust on the walls, as though it had been neglected for years. A cold draft swept in, sending chills through my body. It was unlike anything I had ever felt before. I tried to calm my racing heart and began to gather the supplies. As soon as I picked up the supplies and decided to head back, I heard another strange noise. It was faint but clear, as if someone had softly opened the door or footsteps were coming from inside. I turned to look at the door, but nothing had changed. It was still shut, and everything seemed the same. I tried to brush it off, but a sense of fear was starting to creep in. I questioned whether it was real or just my mind playing tricks on me. I reassured myself and walked out of the ward, but that silence and those sounds lingered in my mind. When I reached the door of the ward, I suddenly felt as if someone was behind me. I turned around, but once again, nothing was there. That moment sent a wave of terror through me, and I realized I might be in a place where something else, something not human, might be present. After placing the supplies back and preparing to leave, I noticed something strange in the corner of the ward. There was a faint glow, almost like a mist of light. This wasn't just any light. It had a mysterious quality, as though someone had turned on a dim bulb that wasn't very bright, but the light itself was strangely captivating. I blinked and looked again, but by the time I stepped forward, the light had faded and disappeared. I dismissed it as a trick of my mind or a malfunction in the old electrical system. But as soon as I got closer to the door, a laugh suddenly echoed through the room. It was a strange laugh, almost as if someone was trying to mask their anger behind it, and it felt charged with a mysterious energy. I froze, my heart racing, and my breath caught in my throat. The laugh was so clear that I couldn't ignore it. It wasn't a regular laugh. It was deep, sorrowful, and it sent a strange shiver through my body. I quickly opened the door and rushed out, my heart pounding so loudly I thought I might collapse. Even as I walked through the hospital corridor, that laugh and the glowing light were still in my mind. I tried to convince myself it was all in my head, but the fear gnawed at me, preventing me from settling down. I couldn't shake the feeling that something was present that wasn't meant to be seen. On the second night, I decided to go back to Ward 7. I was determined to uncover what was going on. The sounds and light from the previous night were now questions in my mind that needed answers. I didn't want to believe that it was just my imagination, so I made up my mind to investigate. As I approached the ward, I heard that same laugh again. It was even clearer this time, and I felt as though it was coming from right next to me. My breath quickened, but I forced myself to remain calm and slowly approached the ward. As soon as I opened the door, the light returned, brighter and more intense than before. It seemed to spread, and I moved toward it. My steps were slow, as if the fear had drained me of energy, but I had made up my mind to find out the truth. I stepped inside and shut the door behind me. As soon as I entered, I felt an eerie sensation. There was something around me that I couldn't see, but I could feel it. Suddenly, a shadow began to approach me. It was the shape of a human, but for some reason, it was faceless. The shadow moved toward me slowly, and when it was close, I stopped. My heart pounded faster, and I knew this was no figment of my imagination. This was real. The shadow stopped in front of me, and I felt like it wanted to communicate something, but my voice had become paralyzed. At that moment, I realized that there were things here that weren't human. The shadow, the light, the sounds, all of it was real, and there were forces at play in this ward that were beyond human comprehension. I stood still, feeling as though time had stopped. The shadow was still moving closer, and fear surged through me. My heart was racing, but some strange urge inside me pushed me to follow it. I took a step forward, and as soon as I neared the shadow, it vanished. I stood frozen for a moment, but quickly regained my composure and began to inspect the room. The silence and stillness around me made me feel increasingly uneasy, and I felt an overwhelming sense of being led to something hidden. In the corner of the room, I found an old file covered in dust. As soon as I picked it up, the dryness and filth on the pages told me that it had been there for years. I opened the file, and what I found inside revealed a horrifying truth. The file contained names of patients who had been treated in this ward, but none of them had ever fully recovered. These patients were not just numbers. Their stories were heart-wrenching. Some had been on the brink of life and death, while others had never recovered from their illnesses, despite treatment. The file also mentioned that their spirits were still trapped in this ward, suffering in deep agony. I was trembling as I read this. Their pain and suffering filled me with dread. This ward wasn't just a place, it was a prison for their lost souls. The spirits of these patients were trapped in eternal torment, and it was a place where no one could ever find peace. This revelation hit me like a shockwave, and I knew now that something far more sinister and supernatural existed in this ward. The spirits, their suffering, the shadow, all of it confirmed that there were forces here beyond human understanding. In the end, I reported everything I had experienced to my superiors. However, their response was dismissive, saying, "This place is old, and strange things happen, but we shouldn't take these stories too seriously." Their words gave me some comfort, but deep down, I knew something was wrong. I finished my shift and left the hospital the next day. Yet, that night, the shadow, the laugh, and the strange light have never left my mind. Those moments echo in my thoughts, and I still don't know what to make of them. Even now, when I sleep at night, I remember that light and that laugh, and I wonder if those patients, who were never healed, are still haunting the hospital in its eerie, mysterious nights. Their spirits remain there, and maybe one day they'll force us to face their suffering. My name is Ryan, and I work at a renowned office in London called Nervous Systems. This incident took place in 2018 when I experienced working at the office at night for the first time. At that moment, I had no idea that night would become one of the strangest and most thrilling experiences of my life. Nervous Systems was a small but well-known technology company where I was employed as a software developer. The office was located in an old building that had previously served as a mental hospital many years ago. When the company established its office in this building, no one paid much attention to its historical significance. We were just grateful to have a place to work, but we were unaware of the hidden stories buried within its walls. The building had been transformed into a beautiful modern office, but there was an unsettling silence in the air, as if every room had once witnessed human suffering. I had never given it much thought, as the pressures of work and daily routines left little time for such considerations. However, when it was my turn to work at the office late at night, I realized there was something about this place that wasn't quite right. As usual, I was working late at night. Everyone else had already left, and I was alone in the office. The silence was overwhelming, but I decided to take advantage of it and focus on completing some important tasks. The air outside was cold, and inside the office, everything seemed shadowy, as though bathed in broken silhouettes. From afar, faint sounds of cars on the street could be heard, but inside the office, there was nothing but deep silence. I still vividly remember that night. The hallway lights were dimmed, casting a faint glow that blurred everything. I was alone, yet it felt as if unseen eyes were watching me from all directions. Something felt off, but I brushed the feeling aside and tried to focus on my work again. After that night, when I returned to the office to work late again, strange and unusual events began to unfold, events that gave my life a completely new perspective. Those moments, which I could never have imagined, started revealing the true history of this office. And that history, as I would come to learn, was deeply connected to my destiny. One night, I decided to stay late at the office to finish some work. By that time, all the other employees had already left, leaving me completely alone. The office was eerily quiet, as if everything was asleep, and oddly enough, I found that silence somewhat comforting. In front of me, my computer screen displayed the important tasks I needed to complete, and I was entirely focused on it. Suddenly, my eyes drifted to my phone. The phone, which had been completely silent just moments ago, was now ringing for no apparent reason. I immediately picked it up, thinking someone might have called me. But when I looked at the screen, there was nothing. No missed call, no name, no record of any activity. It was just silent. A moment later, the phone went back to being still, as if nothing had ever happened. I stared at the phone for a moment, shook my head, and turned my attention back to my work. That's when something else caught my eye. A stack of files on my desk, which I had neatly arranged just a short while ago, had started moving on their own. The files tilted and shifted slightly, as if some invisible hand was playing with them. Startled, I stared at the files, my mind racing with questions. What's going on? The movement of the files was subtle but persistent. Sometimes they would slide slightly in one direction, then another. It felt as though some unseen force was toying with them. I kept watching, trying to make sense of what was happening. My heart was pounding, and an odd humming sound seemed to echo in my mind. I tried to convince myself it was all just a coincidence, but a shadow of fear began to creep into my thoughts. It felt as though there was something in the silence of the office, something other than me, causing these movements. It was as if someone or something was aware of my presence and was trying to send me a message through these strange occurrences. The files on my desk continued to move, one after another, and the sound of their movement combined with my quickened breathing made the atmosphere even more unsettling. In that moment, I felt like I wasn't alone, as though someone was watching me. I told myself it was just irrational fear, a trick of my imagination. But deep down, the doubt and fear were growing stronger. I kept my eyes fixed on the files, watching their every motion with extreme caution. Is this really happening? I wondered. And then, just as suddenly as it had started, the movement stopped. The moment I shifted my gaze away, everything fell silent. Yet my heart continued to race, and my mind was consumed with a storm of questions. After that night, I knew something was definitely going on in that office, something I couldn't explain. The image of those shifting files and the silent, inexplicable phone call remained vivid in my mind. After that night, the strange occurrences in the office continued. I was back to working late, but there was an odd sensation in the air, something that kept unsettling my mind. The eerie silence of the office felt heavier than usual, as though every room, every door, and every corner was trying to communicate something through its stillness. While I was engrossed in my work, I suddenly had the distinct feeling that someone was approaching me. It was as though someone was walking toward me, yet there were no audible footsteps. I glanced over my shoulder, and for a fleeting moment, I saw a shadow move. It was clear, distinct, a dark figure that seemed to creep closer. My heartbeat quickened, and I immediately turned around, but there was nothing there. Just the same empty silence staring back at me. I couldn't believe what I had seen because it was so vivid. That moment burned itself into my memory, refusing to fade. Taking a deep breath, I convinced myself it must have been my imagination. Sometimes, working alone in the office late at night can play tricks on your mind. I brushed it off as a coincidence and turned my focus back to my work, though a faint unease lingered in the back of my mind. Questions swirled in my head. Was that shadow real? Or was it simply a trick of the eye? But no matter how much I tried to rationalize it, the shadow remained vivid in my thoughts, as if it was still watching me. I scanned the office again, and though everything appeared unchanged, I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone. From that moment on, I knew something was wrong, something I couldn't explain. The shadow might have disappeared, but its presence left an imprint on my mind that I couldn't ignore. That shadow, which I initially dismissed as a coincidence, became a recurring part of my nights. It wasn't just a one-off event. Night after night, the shadow appeared, as though it was intentionally following me, pulling me toward something. An overwhelming sense of fear took hold of me, and as time went on, I started to realize this wasn't just random, it was something more. I began to wonder if the shadow was trying to tell me something, to make me a witness to something significant. But I buried my fear, convincing myself it was all in my head. Then one day, while going through the office's old records, I stumbled upon something that changed everything. In the dusty files, I found an old report, one that revealed a shocking history of the building. Before it became an office, the building had been a mental asylum. Patients were admitted here for treatment, but many had died during their stay due to neglect and poor conditions. One particular patient caught my attention, a woman named Marjorie. She had been a resident of the asylum, a forgotten soul who had suffered immensely. The reports indicated that Marjorie was often ignored by the staff and, on one tragic day, succumbed to her deteriorating condition without receiving the care she needed. It was noted in the files that Marjorie was often heard crying in the asylum, her sorrow echoing through the halls. I suddenly recalled a story a coworker had once mentioned in passing, about rumors of lingering spirits in the building. At the time, I had dismissed it as nothing more than a joke. But now, with this newfound knowledge, the pieces began to fit together. It dawned on me that the shadow I had been seeing might be Marjorie's restless spirit. Perhaps she had never left the building and was reaching out to me for help or to tell her story. My heart raced as I realized the shadow wasn't just a figment of my imagination. It was part of a painful history tied to this building. Marjorie's spirit seemed to be trapped here, trying to communicate her pain and seek closure. This discovery was a shocking revelation for me. From that day forward, I became determined to learn more about the history of the building and Marjorie's life. I felt a strange sense of responsibility, as if she had chosen me to uncover her story and bring her some peace. That night, I understood the shadow wasn't merely a haunting presence. It was a remnant of a heartbreaking past, still lingering in the silence of these walls. As I delved deeper into Marjorie's story, the truth became even more chilling. She had been a mental patient undergoing treatment at the hospital, but what she endured was nothing short of inhumane. I discovered that her death wasn't just an unfortunate event, it was the result of neglect and cruelty. The staff at the hospital had ignored her worsening condition, subjected her to mistreatment, and let her suffer in silence until one day, her fragile life came to a tragic end. After her death, rumors began to surface. People whispered that Marjorie's spirit never left the building. It was said she roamed the halls, crying and restless, especially during the quiet hours of the night when the world seemed still. They believed she was consumed by the pain and injustice she had suffered, seeking revenge for the wrongs done to her. I now understood that the shadow I kept seeing was Marjorie's spirit. She had returned, not as a vague apparition, but with a purpose, to seek justice for the atrocities committed against her. She was trying to communicate, and I was the only one who seemed to notice her presence. Questions plagued my mind. Was she driven by a thirst for vengeance? Was she trying to frighten me, or was she pleading for help to tell her story? I began to think that perhaps I was her last hope to reveal the truth about her tragic death. I remembered that her shadow wasn't merely a ghostly figure. It was a manifestation of a pain so profound that it refused to be silenced. As I reflected on everything, fear gripped me once more. I realized that Marjorie's spirit wasn't going to stop until her story was told, and justice was served. After many sleepless nights of deliberation, I made up my mind. I had to bring Marjorie's story to light. Her spirit deserved peace, and I had a role to play in helping her find it. I began by meticulously examining the old records from the building. I uncovered documents detailing the horrific conditions at the hospital and the mistreatment of patients like Marjorie. Hidden among the files was a damning report that revealed how the staff had not only ignored her condition, but actively contributed to her suffering. Further research revealed that Marjorie's family still lived in a suburban area outside London. I gathered all the evidence I could find and paid them a visit. At first, they were stunned by what I shared, but when I showed them the documents, tears filled their eyes. Marjorie's elderly mother, her voice trembling, said, "We always knew she wasn't to blame, but no one ever believed us. Today, you've given my daughter the justice she deserved." Her words moved me deeply. I worked with Marjorie's family to make her story public. The evidence was shared with the media, and soon her tragic tale gained widespread attention. Legal action was taken against the hospital staff who had been responsible for her mistreatment, and Marjorie's name was cleared of all blame. That night, when I returned to the office, the oppressive atmosphere that had haunted me was gone. The shadow I had felt following me had vanished. The silence in the building no longer felt eerie, it was peaceful. Marjorie's spirit, now free from the weight of her pain, had finally found rest. This experience was not just terrifying but profoundly enlightening. It taught me that justice isn't only for the living. Sometimes, it's for those who have long since passed but whose stories still cry out to be heard.